Hello, everybody. In this series of videos, I'm going to teach you about the anatomy of the respiratory system. As we can see on the screen right now, the respiratory system consists of structures broken into both the upper and lower respiratory tracts. Essentially, this series of highly modified tubes is going to, um, first and foremost, deliver inhaled air or inspired air all the way down to the respiratory membrane surfaces. So this is where gas exchange would occur, and allow that same air, albeit with different concentrations of different gases, to return back out of the body. So this is kind of a series of blind-ended tubes. Okay, in this first video, we're going to talk about the upper respiratory tract, which is essentially where air is inhaled into the nose, into the nasal cavity. We're going to see that the nasal cavity is going to filter, warm, and moisten the air. You can think about trying to jog on a really cold day, and just about how cold that air feels as it is entering into your lungs. It is critically important to warm the air, to moisten the air as much as possible, because as we'll see in a future video, these respiratory membranes are very delicate, and we certainly wouldn't want the fluid within those respiratory membranes to freeze, right, and therefore send little ice spicules through the side of our alveolar membranes. Furthermore, we wouldn't want to dry those membranes out. The only way we get gas exchange is with a layer of water, right? Oxygen actually dissolves in water before it crosses over and into our blood. So we absolutely need warm, moistened air coming into our lungs, and that process starts within the nasal cavity. Finally, there's a little bit of filtering action, so anything larger is essentially going to get thrown to the side of the nasal cavity and stuck in mucus. Okay. From there, we're going to see that air is going to be directed down into the pharynx, or commonly called the throat, which is subdivided into 3 different regions depending on what is anterior to it. And then we can see here that there is this bifurcation of this highly modified tube. The posterior tube is going to continue down to the digestive system. So this is your esophagus back here. But the anterior tube actually allows air to be diverted down into the respiratory system. We'll also be able to see that there are some stark differences between these 2 tubes, depending on whether they hold air or whether they hold food and drink. The larynx is where we're going to stop this video, and then the next video we'll pick up with the trachea, or the windpipe. So in this lesson, I am going to be essentially following the pathway of air from outside the body all the way down to the respiratory membranes. The first place into which air is going to enter is the nose and the nasal cavity. Okay, we can see here external nares. So the nares are essentially these little guys on the side of your nose. As I mentioned briefly, this entering air is kind of processed a little bit before it enters lower into your respiratory system, but also this chamber, right, this two-sided and separated by what's called the nasal septum chamber, is also used as a resonating chamber. So essentially, we've all had a stuffy nose in the past, and we know how our voice changes when this cavity is kind of clogged up with mucus, clogged up with snot. And so what's happening there is that these bones surrounding the nasal cavity can't resonate in just the way that they are designed to. And so then this leads to you sounding kind of nasally. Okay, so both the hollow space within your nasal cavity, as well as these sinuses, or these holes within the bones surrounding the nasal cavity, both of those together are important in making your speech sound like what we would expect it to sound like. And we have paranasal sinuses, or next to the nasal cavity sinuses, in our frontal bone here, in our sphenoid bone here. And this is a frontal section of of the skull, so a little bit of a different perspective here. This is actually your nasal cavity, again, separated by that wall or that nasal septum. And on either side of that, we can see the maxillary sinuses. Okay. Above the nasal cavity, and much smaller, maybe a little bit harder to see, here we can see the ethmoid sinuses. Okay, and the ethmoid bone is going to be really important in the nasal cavity structures here in a moment. Next, the nose and the nasal cavity provide an airway for respiration. Right, so this is the one that you think of the most. This is how you inhale or inspire, as we're going to refer to it, air. The nose and nasal cavity filters and cleans the inspired air. And one of the ways that it does that is by essentially creating turbulence of that air. So as we can see in this frontal section, there are little bits of bone that kind of protrude out medially into the nasal cavity and kind of swirl around. Here, protruding out medially and swirling around. And we see this in both halves of the nasal cavity. These are called the nasal conchae. You might remember them from previous A&P instruction. We have a superior nasal conchus, part of the ethmoid bone. We have a middle nasal conchus, also part of the ethmoid bone, and then its own individual bone, the inferior nasal conchus. And so essentially what these guys are doing is they are allowing air to come into the nose and spiral around, essentially creating turbulence, creating swirling air instead of air that is just going to make a beeline all the way back here for the pharynx. Functionally, what this is doing is it is creating centripetal force. And so anything that is heavier, so any particulates, any dust, any pollen grains, anything like that, is going to be flung to the sides of the nasal cavity, which just happens to be covered with a membrane that is called the respiratory mucosa. And so this term right here should indicate to you that this is a mucus membrane. Essentially, it is constantly secreting mucus, which might sound oh so gross, but in fact, this is important because this mucus membrane up here in the nasal cavity is going to trap that extra pollen or particulates or bacteria or whatever and prevent it from going farther down into your lungs. And as I mentioned earlier, it is really important to moisten and warm the air that is entering the respiratory system so that it doesn't damage the structures farther below, which of course are much more delicate. Finally, the nose and the nasal cavity allow us to have the sense of smell. On the roof of the nasal cavity here, which is the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, there are olfactory receptors. Okay, again, you might remember some of this from previous A&P instruction. But essentially, the olfactory bulb sits right here and it sends down some little neurons into this space right here, kind of covering the superior nasal concha. And those neurons are olfactory neurons. And so they are going to, receptors on the surface of them are going to bind to incoming odorant molecules that have been trapped in that mucus. Therefore, depolarizing the neurons, sending an action potential up to the olfactory bulb, back along the olfactory tract / nerve, and then to the brain over here. And so all of those functions are happening in your nasal cavity. Once the air passes through the nasal cavity, right, whatever is left, whatever hasn't been trapped by the mucous membrane, is going to enter into this tube. Right? Remember that our body is pretty much made up of a series of highly modified tubes. So most of these tubes have 3 walls, an inner epithelial layer, a muscular layer in the middle, and then a connective tissue layer all the way on the outside. And depending on the function of those tubes, will determine what their structure looks like. And so this particular tube doesn't necessarily look like what you would think of as a tube, but in fact, it is a tube with 1, 2, and 3 different entrances / exits. Okay, so these 3 different parts, as I mentioned earlier, are named according to what they're connected to on the anterior side. Okay, so Um, think of this tube as connecting the nasal cavity, the oral cavity. Here we can see the tongue and the uvula, and the larynx. Okay, and of course, we can see that to the posterior side is the esophagus. We'll talk about that one later, much later. This modified tube extends essentially from the base of the skull, which we extend this back would be right here, all the way down to C6. And so many times throughout this course and throughout the series of videos, you will be able to see that a lot of times we can use our spine kind of like a yardstick or like a meter stick to determine where exactly different organs are. And so a lot of times I will give you these just as a reference. Okay. Okay, so what are the names of these three divisions of the pharynx? Which of course isn't like a continuous straw-like tube. Instead, it's a straw with a couple holes. Okay. The portion that is posterior to the nasal cavity is called the nasopharynx, literally a compound word between the nasal cavity and the pharynx. The oropharynx, right, oral cavity and the pharynx. As these shifting colors kind of indicate, if you extend the hard and soft palate all the way back, that is the division between the nasal and oral. And finally, the laryngopharynx. This opens up into the larynx, right? So we kind of change the X to a G here to make this a compound word. And so the difference here is essentially this little flappy thing, which we'll learn about next. That is called the epiglottis. Okay, epi meaning on top of, glottis meaning like the opening, like the whole opening into your airways. And so from this epiglottis, that is the beginning of just respiratory structures. Okay, so far, food and drink coming into the oral cavity, right? So this part of the tube does encounter both food and drink. Technically, sometimes food and drink go up into your nasal cavity, right? So that also gets a little bit more abrasion and can also be, somewhat digestive. Not ideally, but it can. But then down here, right, this should only be respiratory, right? You never want to let anything go down the wrong tube, that is, go down the larynx instead of the esophagus. And so this is the beginning of the purely respiratory structures. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these three different subdivisions. The nasopharynx, again, is ideally an air passageway. It does have a little bit more strength to it to protect it just in case, you sneeze while you're trying to swallow or something like that. So it needs to be a little bit more protected. But primarily, it is an air passageway. To assure that your spaghetti doesn't go up into your nasal cavity when you sneeze while eating, we have a couple structures that divert your food and drink down into your digestive system instead of up into your nasal cavity. So here we have a mid-sagittal section, or a series of mid-sagittal sections of the head. Remember, the soft palate is a muscular structure at the posterior end of the hard palate, the bony roof of your mouth. And attached to that, we have the uvula. Okay. When you ingest your food and chew it and are ready to swallow, we have a swallowing reflex, which we'll learn more about in the digestive system, that essentially coordinates efforts of your tongue to push up and therefore pushing your food back, and contracts the soft palate to also contract up, right? More or less closing off the passageway of into your nasopharynx and your nasal cavity. Therefore, the food can only go down into your esophagus. We'll also see that the epiglottis swings shut, right, preventing any food or drink from going down into your larynx and the rest of your airways. Of course, if you are talking while you are eating, this needs to remain open so that you can speak. And so that's when things get a little tricky, because then food and drink can go down the wrong tube. Okay. So what the rest of these are here is essentially showing you what snoring is. Over time, or given genetics or lifestyle choices or you know body health, more or less, these soft palate muscles weaken, and when you are unconscious, when you are sleeping, these muscles relax. Okay, so they're no longer like held up here, allowing to like completely patent or open airways. Instead, they kind of release down here. And so when you inhale air during your sleep, these weakened, relaxed muscles vibrate. And so that vibration is snoring. The nasopharynx also has an opening to another part of your skull. These tubes, the pharyngotympanic, right, actually connecting your pharynx and your tympanic membrane, connects the outside world via your nasal cavity and pharynx with your middle ear. Okay, remember that in the that your external ear is separated from your internal ear and middle ear by that tympanic membrane, or that eardrum. And so in order to equalize pressure between the outside world and inside your skull, right, because there shouldn't be any air that is flowing through those eardrums, those tympanic membranes, the only way that we can equalize pressure, of course, is through these tubes, so that air can flow freely from your nasal cavity and nasopharynx into your ears. Now, of course, if you have ever been on an airplane with a stuffy nose, or if you ever driven up or hiked up a mountain or something with a stuffy nose, I'm sure you can appreciate just how important these pharyngotympanic slash auditory slash eustachian tubes are, because if there is an obstruction here, so too much mucus, the air cannot equalize in pressure, and so you end up with lots more pressure in your head than in the outside world, and so it kind of feels like your head's going to explode, so would not recommend. All right, one other structure that is in the nasopharynx are the pharyngeal tonsils, more commonly called the adenoids. So here we can see on the posterior slash superior end of the nasopharynx, we see these structures that we're going to talk about a lot more when we get into the lymphatic and immune systems. But for now, just knowing where they are is enough. These structures are essentially monitoring whatever is passing by, so whatever is in the air, whatever bacteria or viruses or anything, and essentially looking for anything that doesn't belong. So those pathogens are going to be detected right here in these tonsils and these adenoids. And this can launch a full body immune response. So essentially, we can produce the cells and the antibodies needed to go forth and eradicate those invaders. Okay, we have a pair of these tonsils, so one on each side of our nasopharynx. Generally, these tonsils are the first ones to start to break down or atrophy. Usually this is in the beginning or kind of in the middle of your childhood, right? So they break down. So these ones aren't a prominent part of the adult immune system. Okay. Also, sometimes these get particularly swollen, right? So as we're going to learn, anytime that cells are rapidly dividing, so actively going through mitosis, as they would be if, bacteria or virus was detected on the way into the body, generally structures are going to swell because of those additional cells. They're also going to become a little bit sore because those tissues are stretching out a little bit. And so that's the case anywhere. Like the doctor will like feel your glands or your, feel your glands in your neck here to see or to detect whether there's a lot of mitosis happening, which is an indication that your body is fighting something foreign. Okay. So when this swelling becomes too much, it becomes really difficult to breathe. And so historically, tonsils were removed because we didn't know that they actually did anything. We didn't know they were a critical part of our immune system. And so it's pretty common, certainly in my childhood, for people to get their tonsils out, which everybody loved because, oh yeah, you get to eat ice cream for a couple days, hooray. But in reality, that's an important part of your immune system. Right, so the adenoids were commonly removed historically, not so much anymore. The oropharynx, right? So now we're looking at mid-sagittal section from the right side, same kind of thing going on. So here is the oral cavity, hard palate, soft palate. Here is the tongue, just for some reference. And of course, it opens up into the pharynx here at this opening, which we'll give a name to in a moment. Primarily, the oropharynx is a passageway for both food and air. So this is designed to be able to withstand not only air coming into your body, but also withstand you eating Doritos and having those Doritos scrape down the lining, right, the epithelial lining of the oropharynx. So as we're going to see, the wall of the oropharynx is going to be much thicker than the nasopharynx, because it needs to withstand so much extra stress. As a result, this is a stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, so remember that our epidermis, our skin, has many, many layers of really cheaply made cells, so squamous flattened cells. And so when we brush up against things or scrape our skin, no big deal. We still have so many layers underneath. And because they're so cheaply made, it's not a big deal if some start to slough off. Same exact thing is happening in our oropharynx, except that this is also covered by mucus and saliva. There's a little bit of extra lubrication and protection. Essentially, we want to make sure that your Doritos scraping down the oropharynx isn't going to just poke right through the oropharynx. And so the oral cavity opens into the oropharynx in the big opening in the back of your mouth. If you open up and say, ah, you will see a nice wide opening called the isthmus of Fossus, and this is what it is actually called. On the lateral walls of the isthmus are two more tonsils, so another pair of tonsils. Essentially, when the doctor tells you to open your mouth and stick out your tongue and say, ah, he is looking for these tonsils. Again, if there's a lot of mitosis of different immune cells within these tonsils, the tonsils get swollen, and so they can actually swell out into the lumen, into the opening of the isthmus. And it can be sore. Sometimes it can almost close off that entire opening there, right? So that's essentially what he or she is looking for. And of course, if you have an infection like strep throat or something, there will be some milky residue on that as well. Third and final pair of tonsils, right? Again, we're looking at a mid-sagittal section, so we're only seeing one of each, but in fact, there's one on each side. Actually, as part of your tongue, right? And I'll show you this in the next slide. As part of your tongue, there's another pair of tonsils, and maybe you've looked at your tongue before and never even noticed what these are. Notice that they are there because they blend in really well. They're just like a slightly different texture on the surface of your tongue muscle. Okay. These are called lingual tonsils. Like if you are bilingual, you have two tongues or two languages, and so lingual means tongue. Right. Just to wrap up the three different parts of the pharynx, the essentially larynx, pharynx, extends down into the opening of the larynx. It is continuous with the esophagus, so this is also a passageway for both food and air, but anything after the laryngopharynx is just air or just food and water. Again, the esophagus is on the posterior side. Right, so let's take a look at your tonsils here. This is the isthmus. Here is your tongue, here is your uvula, and here we can see these very uncomfortable looking structures sticking out into the opening, this division between your oropharynx in your oral cavity. So these are your palatine tonsils. They are inflamed, and that is one of the things the doctor is looking for. If you pull your tongue out and to the side and laterally, you will see just a little bit of a different texture from the surface of your tongue or even the ventral surface of your tongue. These are your lingual tonsils. Okay, so the last series of structures I want to talk about in this particular video is the larynx, more commonly called the voice box. In general, the functions are to provide a patent airway that is an open airway. And so remember that structure always matches function. And so in order to keep a tube wide open, right, we can't just have like floppy membranes, like even muscles, right? We don't want to have them, well, actually, like contracting the muscle would close it off. So we can't just have a normal tube with, epithelial muscle and connective tissue. We need something a little bit more. We need something stronger to hold that airway open, because sometimes, that is when we are exhaling, there's really low pressure in our airways, and so these tubes would just collapse. So as we're going to see, the larynx and many of the other respiratory structures have a reinforced layer of their wall. The larynx is also really important in making sure that food and drink don't go down the wrong tube. Okay, we need to make sure they go into the esophagus and not into your airways, because of course they can block your airways and prevent you from breathing. And finally, the larynx differs from the trachea and other airways within the respiratory system because it is highly modified to produce voice. Okay, so let's take a look at the larynx. Here we are looking at the anterior view for some perspective. This little point right here is called the laryngeal prominence, more commonly called the Adam's apple. So testosterone induces this particular cartilage here to grow much larger than when it is under estrogen control. And so this little point right here is going to grow much larger and protrude out much farther, again, under the influence of testosterone, not estrogen. And so this can be seen on the anterior surface of the neck. And it's called the Adam's apple or laryngeal prominence, right? So that's a little bit of perspective as to where this is. Okay. The entire first cartilage of the larynx and the entire cartilaginous airways is called the thyroid cartilage. And it's called the thyroid cartilage not because this is where your thyroid gland, although it's really close. It's called a thyroid gland because it has or cartilage, because it has this characteristic butterfly shape, just like the thyroid gland. Okay. The next cartilage down is called the cricoid cartilage. So the cricoid cartilage here. In between those two, there is a ligament called the cricothyroid ligament. Okay, so these are the first two of the four cartilages that make up the entire larynx. Okay, from here on down, we're going to see C-shaped cartilages. All right, so we'll look at those in our next video. But these cartilages are what open up the trachea. Right, the four cartilages or four types of cartilages in the larynx, they all have special names. They all have special shapes. In order to see the other two types of cartilage, we would need to take a mid-sagittal section through the larynx. And so that's what we see here. The corniculate cartilage, right, is just super tiny. It's kind of like a little triangle that is right on top of the arytenoid cartilage right here. Okay, and so both of these are going to be really important as kind of leverage for muscles to pull on to, essentially to tighten your vocal cords, essentially, or to let them relax. Right? So to tighten and open, or let them relax and kind of close again. Okay, so those are the four cartilages. Some other structures within the larynx. Here we see the single bone in the body that does not articulate with any other bone, and that is the hyoid bone. Okay? This is going to be used again as kind of leverage for muscles to pull on so that we can swallow, so that we can talk, so that we can move our larynx around. Okay? And so that is right here in cross section as well. Okay? And finally, the epiglottis. Right, so this is a fibrocartilage, or sorry, not fibrocartilage, it is an elastic cartilage structure. One of the few elastic cartilage structures in the body. So the others are your ears, right, your pinnas or your auricles. These or this structure must be elastic so it is nice and flexible. Essentially, when you swallow, okay, this epiglottis here in cross section is going to flop down over top of this open airway here. The open airway itself is called the glottis. And so this section is kind of going right through the middle of the open airway. So think of the negative space, and that is the glottis. And so the epiglottis folds down over top of the glottis when you swallow, that is. So let's take another little perspective here. The larynx also contains vocal ligaments, right? So if we were to look down your throat, here's your tongue. So this is the anterior side. Here's the posterior side. Here is your open airway. So this is the glottis itself. Okay. The vocal ligaments are flanking either side of this opening. Right, so we can also call them the vocal cords. They're connected to the arytenoid and the thyroid cartilages. A thyroid cartilage in the front and arytenoid in the back. And so here, if we remove all the muscle and everything, we can see the arytenoid cartilages and we can see the thyroid cartilage. Here is where the anterior vocal folds or vocal cords, sorry, are attached. And here on the posterior side. And so these little cartilages on the posterior side can be moved. Right? We're actually going to see this in the lab. Super cool. They can be moved, allowing these vocal cords to be tightened or to be relaxed. And so the importance of that is that by relaxing and tightening your vocal cords, this changes the pitch of whatever voice, whatever your vocalization is at the time. We also have what are called vestibular folds or false vocal cords. These are the more inferior structures. So in the lab, we're going to see that there's kind of two little bumps that come out into the larynx here. The superior ones are your vocal ligaments, which are on top of your vocal folds. And then inferior to that, there's another little folds coming out into the hole, into the lumen. So this is actually inaccurate. They should be the inferior vocal folds. I apologize for that. And so these are vestibular, implying that they are kind of left over from a previous time. Okay? So, back in the day when amphibians, for example, would spend a lot of time on land, but then would still be able to go underwater, it was really important for them to close off their lungs, right, to make sure that water didn't get into their lungs. And so these vestibular folds weren't part of vocalization. They were actually part of like closing off that airway, because you don't just want to like keep your epiglottis flopped down all the time. So that would prevent vocalization, but by closing these vestibular folds, you could have just one extra layer of protection to keep water from getting into your lungs. And so that is the end of this video for now. Next, you will watch some real vocal cords in action in kind of another little instructional video. So thanks for watching.